Okay, I think we can start. It's almost 8. So welcome to the 114th airhacks TV. And let's start with the very first question being, what are your thoughts about a common shared POJOs libraries between microservices? I think what we would like to know. And I will actually cover this a bit at the workshop, Building Self-Provision Runtimes with Serverless Java on AWS. It's going to be in October, but regardless, why I know it, because I created 1 hour ago the agenda, and this was one of the points. So this was funny, or almost, how to call it, esoteric, right, experience. So what I'm doing in the serverless world, so for me, like not microservices, more like functions, and they all are in the same Maven project. And I built everything together, and the Maven project has no dependencies, so it's still small. And the Maven project is deployed several times to AWS and as AWS Lambda. So it means you have, one project with 5 Lambdas deployed several times. It's the same thing. And but the lambdas are configured differently, so different lambdas are picked from the same jar, if you will. So regarding microservices, we try to absolutely avoid that, even in testing. So what we are doing, we have a microservice module and system test module, and there are no shared dependencies because you wouldn't find no problems with it. So this is completely decoupled, and in some projects we even rely more on the JSON-P and not even JSON binding. So I would say if you have microservices with shared libraries, I would question whether the microservices are really necessary. So this would be the first idea. So wouldn't a monolith would be better, right? So this would be my thing. Okay. So greetings back to Paraguay. So this is the POJOs. We covered that. And Ike asked me, is there a way to package synchronous Quarkus HTTP event consuming AWS Lambda with another asynchronous Lambda in the same Maven module? Absolutely, I do it all the time. So what you can do, you have one. To be precise, Quarkus registers one Lambda, and this is like generic Lambda. There can be only one, but such a Lambda dispatches the HTTP events to as many endpoints as you like. Now, on top of that, you can still have, 20 lambdas inside the same package, which are asynchronous. And this is my common architecture. So we have a couple of HTTP endpoints, which are running as HTTP lambda, and a couple of fully asynchronous functions in the same Maven module. It absolutely is working. So Carlos asked me a question. What do you recommend to consume faster 60K messages by hour in a queue in AWS infrastructure? So the question is, does it have to be a queue? 60,000 per hour is not much, actually. So you can go with a Lambda without a queue. If you would like to have a queue, I would go with SQS or Kinesis. This would be my recommendations. Yeah, but the question is, do you really would like to have a queue? A semi-queue would be an HTTP Lambda on Quarkus, which talks to DynamoDB. So DynamoDB is transactional, so it's almost like a queue. And if you would like to have a queue on the other side, you can have Dynamo streams, which what the streams are doing. The events are published as a stream, and you can. This is almost like Debezium. So Ike asked me. I think. Zoltan asked me, do I plan new online workshops? Yeah, they are already live, actually. So there are 2 workshops, AWS Security Authentication and Authorization for Java in December, and Serverless Java Patterns and Best Practices on AWS. And I'm already thinking, in spring, maybe to offer one pure Java workshop without any cloud, so just back to Java. But let's see. I have some ideas, but I also have to, to be excited about that. So this is the 2 workshops in autumn. Then it's a Basel One conference. I'm also offering a workshop at the Basel One conference, and the workshop I already showed you in Katowice and in Gdynia, Poland, both workshops, as also about AWS serverless. Okay. Now, so where do you recommend to add a rate limiting for Quarkus REST API on Quarkus app itself, or a reverse proxy or somewhere else? In my first time adding it, I don't know what's the best practice. So in current projects, I will add it to the HTTP API gateway. This is where you can add API keys or rate limits. This would be my choice, because if I'm in the cloud, I would like to use the cloud. I wouldn't like to implement this by myself. And HTTP API gateway uses like a bucket algorithm, is called, right? So if the bucket is filled up, and it's also then it's going to be throttled. So HTTP API gateway, or if you are not on AWS, then on the reverse proxy. So Luis, hey, from Paraguay. So there's actually a huge following from Paraguay. So thank you. And how late is in Paraguay right now? Is the same time zone? I'm just interested. And how warm or cold is in Paraguay in Celsius would be also nice to know. Okay, so we covered the workshops, and we covered this workshop. And by the way, it's interesting. Maybe I say hello to him, because he is one of the founders of the Smashing magazine, actually, a very famous magazine. So I would like to have to chat with Vitaly about web components, of course. Let's see whether I will have time for it. Okay. Yeah, airhacks FM podcast, just quickly. There's a recent episode about FlywayDB, and there's a really surprising episode coming soon about boundary control entities, so stay tuned. This would be an interesting one, and I was very nervous on that one, so stay tuned next week. And also nice one, why MicroStream is faster, was airhacks FM episode, where we talk what MicroStream is doing behind the scenes. Was really nice chat. So this was... and of course, Mr. Heinz Kabutz, as always, also interesting, with even clicking sounds. And the last episode for now with Shay Almog about debugging. You can, Benjamin asked me, you mentioned API gateway for rate limiting, but is that used for microservices? Yes, you can use HTTP API gateway for microservices as well. I mostly use it for lambdas. For microservice, you can use it, but you have to pay for it. What you can also use as rate limitation is application load balancer or web application firewall, of course. Okay, and if you use HTTP API gateway, use the HTTP API, not the REST API, because it's a lot cheaper. So, okay, Ike is very active today. The asynchronous lambda invoked by HTTP event from event bridge through API gateway. I mean, if you are in Event Bridge, you don't have to go over HTTP API gateway. Event Bridge can directly create an event, and the asynchronous lambda can consume the event. So I wouldn't create an HTTP event in Event Bridge and go to Quarkus via HTTP. I would create an I would create a custom Event Bridge event, or AWS Event Bridge event, and a Pojo lambda without Quarkus will consume it. So it's just fully asynchronous lambda. What if the gateway has timeout? It is configurable. It's always a timeout, but the gateway has a timeout. Everything has a timeout, I would say. Yeah. Okay. Now, very first question. The very first question was from QL. And hello, Java developer. I have a question about Java sockets. And he was really persistent about Java sockets. He would really like to see Java sockets. So I created a short about Java client socket. And this was basically it. So there was a huge excitement about Java sockets. So there's a client socket. I wanted to record a server socket short as well, but actually forgot it. And no one asked for that. But I will do it. So just a short about server socket in Java, java.net.server socket. So we have both sides. Okay, now, so this is the short. TikTok, no, I'm not on TikTok. I'm happy that, it's just YouTube. So I'm already busy with YouTube. And now Mr. Krizu has a lot of questions. So make it a little bit larger. And what does your test stack look like on AWS? The really great stuff. I don't have a specific test stack on AWS. So Quarkus runs locally and accesses the cloud. So my test stack on AWS is a test account on AWS. So I'm accessing directly a test account. So if I'm a client, I have my client account. If my clients don't care, I create a shadow account in my organization with the name of the client. I can just use as a test if my clients care about that. Like for instance, one of my clients right now. So I have a test account on my client side, and I'm just using the account for test purposes. So again, I'm able to do everything locally. So Quarkus is starting, and my Quarkus is accessing S3, DynamoDB, SQS, SNS, Kinesis remotely. If we are doing, the asynchronous lambdas is a little bit more problematic. So we have to test in the cloud anyway. So I don't believe in local too much. And by the way, most problems you get in the clouds are usually security, permissions in networking. If you have VPCs and you cannot test that locally. So I don't believe in local development. Except unit tests. So if there is something, which can break, for instance, JSON parsing is a typical thing, right? So if, for instance, we mentioned the events. So what happens is the AWS event has to be, extracted, which is not, because usually you get an array of events and you have to extract them and, to extract the information from that. And this is what I would like to do in a unit test, because what is the point of deploying the Lambda and find out that you are picking the wrong slot? Does it make any difference on cloud on premises? In my projects, huge difference, because my philosophy is if I use the cloud, I would really like to use the cloud. So the main difference is on premises, my Java applications are more powerful. So there is more stuff implemented inside the Java application, and in the cloud they are leaner. For instance, right, in the cloud I don't have security inside the applications. It only what only happens. I get the ready to use JSON Web Token. The OpenID connect happens in application load balancer, for instance, not in application or Quarkus. Matrix zum Beispiel, right? Like a MicroProfile matrix, I'm not using in the cloud because they are usually implemented by the cloud, Azure Monitor or CloudWatch metrics. So I don't need MicroProfile metrics. So this is the difference. But if there is no difference, it maybe means lift and shift. And then I will question the cloud altogether, because what it only means, you just moved your on-premise project to the cloud. And what it usually means to your client is you will have pay more money for nothing, basically. What I'm using for load testing, so I tend to use Apache Benchmark as a quick hack. And then there was, I forgot actually, Vendetta, I think. I forgot actually the name. There was a Go-like project, like Apache Benchmark, and I will have to find it out. I think Vendetta was called. And JMeter, of course. If it's a little bit more complicated, I use JMeter, which is Java-based tool for load testing. And sometimes we implement our own, performance testing, a small Java application, usually with executor service, to have load testing. But there are different cases. For instance, I will implement soon a load testing use case to estimate costs. So we would like to generate a lot of traffic for one night and see how expensive it is, for instance. What are you using for end-to-end tests where you simulate user clients? So in front end I use Cypress, and back end we implement it in system tests, and even currently in use case or multi-system tests. So what it means is one Quarkus module with just JAX-RS is talking to multiple servers. Whether I have experience with Grafana and K6, you maybe mean Kibana. What your experience on-prem is great. In the cloud, you have to run Grafana, manage Grafana and Prometheus, and maybe it is too expensive. So for instance, in AWS, I'm using CloudWatch metrics because they are built in and there is nothing to install and therefore usually cheaper than CloudWatch plus Grafana. So it really depends. On-premise, Grafana is great. On the cloud, it really depends. So run clients simulators. Yes, I would use on AWS on EC2 instances. For instance, in one project, we needed Windows, and I was about to implement this on EC2 machines. So test data in the cloud, it is simple. For instance, on DynamoDB, we restore from backup. I will do the same with Postgres, and I will automate the process with code build. So this is what I will do. And back then, we always did it in a project with Oracle. I ran the Oracle recently in a Docker container, and the project, I don't know, it was more than 10 years ago. What I remember, I used Vagrant on HashiCorp Vagrant, and the HashiCorp to set up a database in a virtual machine, and I always reuse the same set of data. So I always try to have like a data capsule which can be restarted from fresh. And in the cloud is great because whatever database you have, it is automated. What I prefer is our cloud, proprietary cloud native database, because the automation is faster and easier. So it is very simple to create a DynamoDB table and load it. It's far easier and faster than set up the entire Postgres or MySQL database, for instance. S3 is even simpler to set up. Yeah, this was this question. So Krizu, you are hyperactive. Very good. So how do you reset the data? Oh, this is what I said right now. Is snapshots or from backups, or this is what I do, right? Okay, so how do you separate REST endpoints versus regular HTTP endpoints? I think what Luis is asking, they are like API endpoints, right? And endpoints for the view. I'm not separating them. Usually, I only have API endpoints, and if you would really have to have a specific endpoints, so we have usually something in between. A microservice which provides, client-specific endpoints, or you could think about GraphQL, for instance, right? How do you propagate JW token through event bridge into Lambda? So if you really have to, it will be payload of the event, right? And is there a repo with multiple lambdas deployment? Is there a repo with multiple? So as I said, I have one Maven project which is in one repo with multiple lambdas, and the JSON Web Token propagation from Event Bridge. So as I I think you know what. So if you don't have HTTP API in Quarkus, right? So what you will have to do is you will have to decode the JSON Web Token in the POJO Lambda. If this what happens, and if you call the Quarkus via HTTP, then in EventBridge or whatever, you will have to create a header with authorization bearer to have an automatic experience. Very good. What do you do for versioning in Quarkus? Do you use URL-based versioning? No. URL-based versioning, or no. In one project, I'm forced to do so because this is the spec. But usually I try to avoid that because what happens on the version v3, right? So you have, to tell all v1 and v2 clients that the that new version is around. So what I will do is ship one version and write more tests to ensure the backward compatibility. Okay, this was the data reset. Guy Katz asked me, best way to integrate a non-XA with XA? This is actually a recurring question. And there's one hack, one trick. If you have two-phase commit, there can be one resource, which is non-XA compliant resource. And you can set up in all application services part of the protocol. So why that? Because in two-phase commit, it is like the entire protocol works like this. There is a begin, then you get back, is begun. There's prepare for commit. Everyone answers prepare for commit, and there is a commit. And if you have one non-compliant XA resource, the prepare for commit is not called, and in the final round, the final resource gets, the overall commit. This is the entire trick. Chris asked me, how do you deliver your apps on AWS with CDK? Just using GitLab, CI or similar, AWS co-deploy? And not even AWS co-deploy. Co-deploy is great for ECS Fargate, for instance, because you get blue-green deployment for free. So what co-deploy does is it can orchestrate the load balancer. And if I have lambdas, we just use code build in code pipeline. And how this works with Git commit would work with EventBridge, GitLab, newer version, Bitbucket, and GitHub are there are native integration. And recently we had to do it with GitHub. You have to install an app in GitHub, and the app AWS app in GitHub, and this app sends a trigger to a source connection in AWS and starts the entire process. So I always start with trunk-based development. This is my way to go. So what it means is I try to prevent, branches, because the branches have to have a specific meaning. And what branch means to me is holding back features and release them at once, like flushing them at once, right? If you have trunk-based development, what it means is whatever works is pushed to production or to the stage environment. It doesn't have to be production. So trunk-based development is the starting point. And branches I only do if there are specific requirements. I try to avoid branching. And in one project there was a lot of branching with the result, at the beginning of the sprint, every developer branched the code, and then the sync point after 2 weeks was never met, because there was a huge mess during the merge time. So branches are often misused, not to. It's actually counterproductive sometimes, because they are misused to avoid merging, actually, right? Okay. Louis asked me, I have two projects. The front has regular HTTP and the second has the API endpoints, but I was wondering, bringing them together was... So you can bring them together, but you can get inspired by Quarkus. What Quarkus is doing is, for instance, they have a queue for admin endpoint, and anything else is business. So you can have queue for admin, let's say C for client, and API prefix for your API endpoints in one project. So I would say if you can ship a monolith, do it with monolith, right? It always depends how many developers are working with the project. So if you have two projects, there could be one team which only cares for the mapping between Angular and backend. And if you have one project, of course, it is harder. So you get merge conflicts all the time, right? Benjamin asked me, what do you use for writing complex long SQL queries? I would say for really long queries, I use JDBC plain. So I would say if JPA doesn't work for me or Hibernate, I just switch to JDBC. It's just actually with Java records, it's just perfect. So JDBC is not as bad. If you have a huge query, it is usually not a problem. I would use prepared queries, of course, to map the results to Java record. I would say not problem at all. Okay, now let's go a little bit here. Mr. Daniel Vamara, friend of the show and through airhacks, he attended the airhacks at Munich Airport, actually. And he asked about, exactly, I read the question before, is about how to deal with persistence exceptions. And I think the problem you have is especially with persist on merge and optimistic locks. So what can happen is that so you get the exception after the method, because if the transaction happens outside the business method, so you cannot catch the exception inside the backend method. I think this is your problem. So there was a trick. I never tried it with Quarkus, but tried it with Whitefly and Glassfish several times. So what you can do is you can invoke Entity Manager Flash, which causes flashing, and then most of the exceptions happens inside a business method, and you can catch the exceptions. So this would be one such thing. And another hack would be, to start the transaction in an interceptor. So this is what you can do. Another question is about JPA Streamer, and I have to tell you, I have no production experience with JPA Streamer, but so I cannot help you with that. So I will have to play with it first until I say something, which I don't know. So I don't use JPA Streamer. I also try to avoid Panache because, of course, it's Quarkus invention, and for me, Panache is nice, but JPA is not bad. So if I can, I use JPA. So this is my personal opinion, but Panache is still great, and Panache is based on standards, so nothing against Panache. But I have to less argue in projects. So this is also interesting. So maybe see, your name is Pablo Ruiz. Oh, this is also a friend of the show. I know Pablo. And this is an interesting one. So what happens is it is request scoped, and I think what you would like to do is to return to use no asynchronous completable future. And if you think about this, it cannot work what you would like to achieve, because if I have, I call request scoped, and in the request scoped call, there is an asynchronous call. So what can happen is that the asynchronous call runs longer than the synchronous call. And if it runs longer, it means, the scope is lost. I mean, what you can do, right? So so there, if I understood you correctly, what you like to do, this won't work. On the other hand, what I'm also doing right now, I'm using the reactive JAX-RS in Quarkus without the reactive API, and there are some bugs, like for instance, container request filters. There's no dependency injection there, so maybe you are run also to the same problem. So if I didn't understood you correctly, so if it happens in the first facet, try to switch from JAX-RS reactive to JAX-RS just classic and see whether the problem still persists or if you get the problem. But if you use completable future, if you think about this and you have asynchronous call, you are losing the request, because request is synchronous. You cannot, within request scope do something asynchronous, because, this doesn't make any sense, right? Now, Tiago, he actually watched all the airhacks TVs, which kudos to Tiago. But he cannot watch today, which is not a big deal, because he will rewatch everything anyway. So he asked me, can we say the opinion what new Jakarta projects are Quarkus and Spring? Do you start any new thin war projects? So I have no experience still with Spring, and I never use a Spring in my projects from scratch. As I already mentioned several times, I helped some clients with Spring, but never started a Spring project. Why not? Because for unknown reasons, I stick the entire career with Jakarta, Java, MicroProfile, servlets, or whatever, right? I try to avoid any external dependencies. Maybe this was one of the reasons. A similar mindset to the Panache, right? So if I can stick with MicroProfile, I do MicroProfile. There's no need, to use Quarkus specific stuff. Okay, so now thin war projects. I think the last thin war project was before the pandemic, I guess. So it is like 4 years old. And why that? Because since pandemic, cloud exploded. All my clients wanted to have cloud, and I do now public cloud all the time. I think I only have one on-premise Kubernetes project. Everything else is public cloud. So it means thin wars I don't use them anymore. But there was an interesting case in the recent, it was I think in December, last December, airhacks Live workshop. There was an attendee, I think from Australia, and what they did, they run on large EC2 machine a application server, and they deployed multiple wars to save money. And I find this interesting. So what you still can do in the cloud is you can ship one application server which runs all the time, and ship on the application server several wars. It is very the same mindset what we did at the beginning of Java. We bought one huge machine, installed the application server, and deployed wars to save money. You can do the same at the cloud. And right now, buying a larger EC2 machine, in advance, or provisioning a larger Fargate cluster and starting the application server and shipping as many wars as you like. So this can be an opportunity, but it's like a cost-driven decision. Right now we are not doing this, so we are going with serverless, means mostly Lambda. And why Lambda? Because Lambda is the closest to the idea of application servers. Okay, so let's see. Mari asked me, I'm wondering if you define a response DTP as the response of all your endpoints. No, I usually it's just JSON-P. What is the best practice for response of an API where you can have different type and handling errors easily? So handling errors easily is defined in the HTTP spec. So if you get error 400, let's say, there's actually clearly defined how it should look like. So I'm returning back only in the case of 200 and business object, but not response DTO, something business-like, I don't know, a workshop and developer or something like this. And this can be JSON-B or JSON-P. So in projects which are struggling or dealing with versioning, use it as JSON-P. In a simpler project, it's a Java record or JSON-B class. So Benjamin, if you don't mind, okay, this is asynchronous events. This is great because my attendees, how we call it, viewers or airhacks, are helping each other, which is great. By the way, there is a Discord, I think HTTPS, I hope, Discord GG/airhacks. I think this is right, and everyone is invited, so you can have still the conversation there. I even have a channel, airhacks channel, so if you like, you are welcome. Now, Benjamin Artnik asked me, what do you name the classes you consume and return your API endpoints? JSON-P has no name, so there's like JSON-P, yeah. For example, if you have an add user endpoint, do you consume add user requests and return add user response? I don't like that. I would consume an user and return. If you return a user, I will return a user. And usually, if there is a create user, there is nothing to return because 201 will return location header and 201, right? But if you say, okay, I have a huge amount of endpoints to implement, I get this spec from outside, and it looks like this, then I will do this. But I never did it so far. I saw this. This is neither best practice, worst practice. It's just I practice one possibility, but I don't like such things because what happens in one request just returns nothing, 204. So would you still return add user response, which is null, or what you will do, for consistency reasons? So I spend more time on names, I would say. I don't like generic names where you don't have to think about. So I would spend more time with the naming, and endpoints can have a proper object, so there's no need to abstract. In my experience, sharing the same class user in this example eventually creates some problems. Yeah, but what you could do, you can pass JSON-P object and spend some time, invoking the get string or whatever and create your proper user, so you have the mapping for free. So this is what you can do, and this works well. But this is not general advice or best practice. Okay, cool. So now, this was the from the blog. Now, friend of the show, Christian Frey, asked me, Quarkus recommends the usage of micrometer over MP metrics. So the question is, really, right? So if you go to Quarkus, what they are saying is that the micrometer is the recommended approach to metrics for Quarkus. And it says when Quarkus will upgrade to Eclipse MicroProfile 6, the smaller metric support will be discontinued. So if you go now to MicroProfile 6, which ships with MicroProfile 5 metrics, you see that a MicroProfile 5 metrics recommends internal implementation of micrometer. So What will happen is that the Quarkus will ship, I hope this is what will happen, with MicroProfile 5, which will implement internally with micrometer, which I don't care. Like, some of the fault torrents in MicroProfile were shipped with historics from Netflix, which I also didn't care how it's implemented. And MicroProfile file is going to be great because you get custom scopes, so you can define your own scopes, applications, and so forth. Having said that, I'm not using metrics in cloud environments. For instance, on Lambda, I just rely on the built-in metrics, and if I run on ECS Fargate, for instance, I use EMF embedded metrics format because it's built into CloudWatch. If you are running MicroProfile metrics, you still need something which scrapes the metrics. And if you set up managed Prometheus, for instance, it costs a lot of money. So to save money, we use EMF embedded metrics format in log format. So we format or we write logs in a specific format, which is immediately recognized by CloudWatch metrics and is the easiest way to go. And of course, what we could do, you could emit MicroProfile metrics in a cluster, and then have an agent which scrapes all the metrics, but you have to pay for the agent and for the data transfer as well. If you set up Prometheus, the first question is going to be how much metrics you are writing and their costs associated with it. That's the problem with cloud, cost-driven development. Okay, cool. And if you are interested in it, what started the micrometer thinking on Quarkus, there's an airhacks number 140 about the background because Erin Schnabel used the MicroProfile metrics and she found some bugs and really started to hate MicroProfile metrics and said, okay, what if we would use let's say a micrometer. Okay, now everything is covered. So last question. Have you used Java flight recorder in production? Yes, we have removed most logging statements in favor of JFR and remote processing. Luis, this is the best statement ever. This is actually the entire point. If you're running your applications on premise, you could use, for instance, JFR and have better traceability and observability than in the cloud. So I would say if you stay on premise, then use what's the killer features, what you can use on premise, like, using all the JVM features you can get. And if you are in the cloud, just, focus what cloud gives you. And so great idea. And JFR is a way better than logging. And what you can do with JFR, there are lots of custom events, It is very easy to create a custom event. So you can have a custom business events even, and take a look at JFR view is called. So you can have kind of a predefined view, this is command line interface, to gather information from the events. What's your experience with AWS X-Ray? So AWS X-Ray is like distributed tracing. It works great, but for some services, the trace ID is not propagated. So you should look at AWS Lambda Power Tools. And this AWS Lambda Power Tools propagates, the state or the context for you, the span for you. So X-Ray is like Jaeger. Okay, now Time Machine, the last one. So Gulam said, stop talk about Java. He sent me an email, but it was in 2015. So I actually forgot what he wrote. So forget about that. But the second one is interesting because there was a huge, back then drama about MVC framework and JSF. And do you think JSF will become obsoleted by this MVC framework? So funny enough, last week we had a meeting in a team, and everything still likes JSF in the project. So we'll go with web components as an extension, but JSF was the best decision ever in the project for years. I don't know, they used JSF for 15 years, and they had less trouble with Angular, for instance. So I would say right now I wouldn't use JSF anymore for the reason, because if you're in the cloud, JSF can be stateless, but usually it's configured in a stateful way. So you will have, to set up the load balancers properly. And there are not a lot, of competition there. So, the Prime Faces is, I would say, the only major component provider, which is a bit dangerous. So, yeah. So I'm using now web components, or JSF. I mean, this is like legacy project. I'm not starting a new JSF projects anymore. But if there will be more component models, I would think about this. Actually, what I thought already is to implement something with JSF or even JSPs, because it's, JSF, servlets or JSPs, which is basically the same technology. But right now, no need in my projects, right? And in leisure, maybe. So, the Mike reads consistency, availability, partition tolerance cap in the old book or old real world Java EE patterns, and he said, okay, distributed here. Distributed means here refer only to apps where you run in presentation in one process and run your business logic in another machine. Says there is no cluster. So don't distribute. What I meant by 8 years ago, I still mean right now, is if you think about the Lambda, what you're doing right now, right? The Lambda is basically, it's not a clustering. It's very similar to clustering, by the way. We can have 100 Lambdas active at the same time if you have exactly the same request. If request arrives exactly at the same time, at the same moment, it will start multiple Lambdas which access the same database. So what's the difference? If you, for instance, are using DynamoDB, you can access DynamoDB in milliseconds, in sub 10 milliseconds, or to call it less than 10 milliseconds, and which is fast enough, so you don't need, the session management in the Lambda. Back then, it was slower to access the database, so we cached the session state in the application server, which was replicated, which caused some problems. So this is actually what happens in the last 8 years. There's a question about sending and receiving emails, and what if you would like, to receive an email. I hope my answer back then was James, Java, Apache Mail Enterprise Server. I think is still around, so you can use Java Mail also to retrieve emails. How do you inject properties using CDI that can change at runtime? Classic one, inject instance and you can fetch them, but usually in cloud nothing has to change at runtime. If it does, for instance, I would use the system manager config to fetch the current state via HTTP. So it's one call, no problem. Okay, that was is Java EE more secured and faster than Microsoft ASP.NET MVC? Interesting one. I would say back then, I'm not sure. Right now, I would say Java is really secure. And I don't know whether it's more secure than MVC, how to measure this, right? So I would say you have to know to measure the amount of bugs or security problems on Azure and on Java. So is it a good idea to move the business logic Java code from our service layer to stored procedures on DB level? It can be actually. So sometimes it's a good idea to move, the logic closer to the data to achieve better performance or save costs. Okay. Where is the bean XML? Still classic one. Back then it was in WebInf classes, and right now in Quarkus this is optional. Porcupine was actually interesting framework, which Hystrix and Porcupine is the same animal, by the way. So it was like an monitoring framework, but I didn't update this for years. AMX was management in Glassfish or Payara. I would say not that interesting anymore. And the EJB is also not that interesting. So let's see what's questions in the chat. I'm rather new to programming and I'm starting out in Java. Any tips would be appreciated. So what I'm doing right now, I'm actually recording daily Java shorts at YouTube. Maybe you will enjoy them because it's just random shorts. I enjoy them a lot, but this is like 60 seconds with Java. So, and if you would like to know something, ping me. You can ping me on Discord, write a comment to the short, and the new shorts are usually inspired by older comments. So, unbelievable. I would say 20 or more questions we covered this week. I wish you the best September you can imagine, and see you in October. So, thank you, Daniel, Luis Daniel. And I hope, and I like your idea with JFR, actually. I actually was about, maybe I I wanted actually to deliver a talk about, on-premise versus on cloud, and I say, okay, if you are on-premise, you can do stuff like Java Mission Control and JFR, which you cannot do easily in the cloud unless you are running Kubernetes with your own infrastructure, and this, is more complicated than on-premise. So thank you all, and see you next month. Bye.